This lesson covers the concept of cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions is not an original part of DBT. This is borrowed from cognitive behavior therapy. And in fact, most of DBT isn't original. Marcia is willing to admit that she took many different validated treatment techniques and combined them to create this framework. And so lots of what you're hearing over the course of this course, you might recognize from other places in your life or therapy journey. What makes DBT unique is the way that these skills are woven together. We use the concept of cognitive distortions in application of mindfulness of thoughts, specifically when we're practicing observe and describe our thought patterns. Cognitive distortions give us a framework for observing particular patterns of thoughts that tend to be unhelpful and that are probably fueling dysregulation or at the very least increasing emotional intensity. The goal when we notice cognitive distortions in our thought processes is to observe them, to label them as such, and then to choose to rewrite in a way that doesn't increase emotional intensity. There are about 25 acknowledged distortions in the psychological community. Today we're going to focus on about 10 of them that are the most widespread. I'll share some examples and ways that these tend to show up in my clients' thought patterns, as well as the DBT skills or concepts that kind of overlap with this specific language. In our discussion of cognitive distortions and mindfulness, it is important to remember this foundational fact. Thoughts in of themselves tend to be paradoxical. There's a whole slew of skills and techniques we can learn to manage, control, change our thought processes. However, no matter how skillful you become, your brain will still always be cued to take in information from your environment. Thus, we can gain control of our thoughts in many ways. However, it is impossible to have 100% control of your thoughts. We're taking in sensory data at all time, and we can be cued from that sensory data. For example, if I told you, don't think about pink elephants before the end of this video, you're probably thinking about pink elephants right now. That's just how we're wired. So we can gain some control over our thoughts, but we won't ever have full, complete control. It's just how humans are wired. When talking about these distortions, we're going to look at patterns, how they show up most frequently, and using describe of distortions as a non-judgmental way to notice when your thoughts are being unhelpful and cue them to a thought process that is not dysregulating, is not firing negative emotions, is not increasing the intensity of negative emotions. There are about 25 generally recognized distortions in the psychological community, and we're going to cover about 10 of them today. We're starting with all or nothing thinking, which is the most common one, also referred to as black and white thinking. This is definitely shaped by our culture in general. When we talk about religion and the constructs of good versus evil, or politics and Republican versus Democrat, so many things that we are exposed to as we're developing and creating our construct of the world end up in these really polarized dyads. And so we learn to see the world as either or, missing all the area of gray that happens in the middle. Modern political culture, especially the last 5 years, polarization is more acceptable and reinforced by general society. As a culture, we seem to be losing our ability to look for that in between. Neurodivergent individuals tend to really struggle with black and white thinking. And this is both a behavioral aspect and a thought aspect. Behaviorally, I was the kid that either I wanted to do my paper or my assignment perfect, get a 100, best grade in the class, or I wasn't even going to write a draft to turn in. There was no in between. In neurodivergent individuals, this tends to fuel cycles of start-stop. I'm fully engaged in this. I'm creating a lot. I get bored. I walk away. It's never finished, so I never see a payout. In thought processes, this can look like idealization, devaluation, where you think someone is fantastically amazing or they're the worst person in the world. So when we think about black and white thinking, it gets us in trouble because it's in extremes. And our goal is to use our dialectical processes to be able to synthesize between the two poles. When you recognize I'm all the way over here, what are the ways that I can help move myself towards the center? I'm sure that you can come up with plenty of examples of how all or nothing thinking exists in your life, because it's just such a prevalent one. And if you take only one thing away from this discussion of distortions, use that to modify your relationship with all or nothing thinking. Okay, the next three are kind of clubbed together. They're overgeneralization, mental filter, and discounting the positives. Overgeneralization is when you take one event and you use that event as a fact to support a conclusion based only on that one fact. So if I sat in traffic and was late to a meeting at work, and then I told myself I am a complete failure because I was 5 minutes late, even though I have a 30 plus year life cycle of like, I have accomplished these tasks and met these demands. But nope, I'm using this one piece of data to support my conclusion. I'm a failure. Mental filtering is when we notice things based on the conclusion we've already drawn. And this is similar to discounting the positive. The example we typically use for these two is like you're ready to buy a new car. In your head, you typically know what car it is that you truly desire. But the process tends to be, I'll look at this car and I'll look at, a couple of other comparable brands. When we're receiving information, our brain naturally tends to filter out the facts that support the ideas that we already have. So if I want the Mustang, I'm going to be more likely to focus on the positives of the Mustang and ignore the negatives that come with it. And in reverse, I'm more likely to ignore the positives of a Camaro and focus on the negatives because that's already what my brain desires. This can be unhelpful when you live in an echo chamber, when everyone around you espouses the same ideas as you and beliefs are constantly reinforcing. We know that, our minds were meant for openness and exploration and adding in new information. And so we don't want to get stuck in places where we just constantly reinforce the beliefs or assumptions we already have. Okay, the next two fall under the header of jumping to conclusions. In DBT, we would call this assumptions. They are mind reading and fortune telling, and both tend to overlap with childhood trauma, and both tend to be things that we develop as survival skills, but that don't suit us once we get out of that traumatic developmental environment. And so it's important to remember, and I'm sure you've seen this on a couple of your worksheets by now, that we cannot observe the thoughts, emotions, urges, or experience of another human being. We can observe their outward expression of them, and as individuals who are neurodivergent, who love patterns, and as people who have been through trauma and have had to be super aware of the behaviors of others, we probably can make pretty accurate guesses about what is going on. We've developed that skill set. However, if we're making assumptions about people's experience, we're not checking in with the facts, we're not looking at the validity of our assumptions. And so mind reading is the idea that I know what you're thinking. You may have a pretty good guess, but until you ask another person, how are you thinking about this? What exactly is going through your mind? There's no way to know. Fortune telling is expecting that you know the outcome of something. Again, you may have a pretty good ability to statistically assume what will likely happen, but we can't know with 100% certainty. And what we do know is that when we're future tripping and we're really worried about worst case scenarios or consequences of actions, we tend to manifest the thing that we want to avoid in the first place. Okay, moving on to magnification and minimization. So these are opposites of each other. Magnification can be described also as catastrophizing. So that's the idea that you take one small piece of information and you use it to fuel a worst case scenario thought. So again, going back to traffic, I'm 5 minutes late to a meeting. No matter what my previous work record is or how much I've established a name for myself, if I think that because I'm late to this meeting, I'm going to get fired and be homeless, that's the process of magnification. Minimization is the undervaluing of information that is relevant. An example for this would be if you chose not to do a test in a college class that counts for 25% of your grade, but you keep showing up for all your other classes and doing the work, even though like it's probably pretty likely that like with that 0, you can't even pass the class, right? So not properly weighting the consequences that you're likely to face and doing actions that just don't make much logical sense. Okay, next is emotional reasoning. This coincides with mood-dependent behavior or willfulness. I'm sad, so I'm entitled to be sad. It doesn't matter if I know how to be skillful. My emotions are real and I deserve to feel them, and I can live exactly how I want because they tell me to right now. That's emotional reasoning. Next one is shoulds. This ties in with the concept of non-acceptance. Typically, shoulds are rooted in our beliefs about how we are supposed to do life. And especially for neurodivergent individuals, typically our shoulds are based in the perceptions that neurotypical individuals have shared with us about how we should go about approaching life. Should statements are not helpful. They make us feel bad about ourselves. They lead to judgments. And again, often they are not tied into our own value set. Give yourself permission that if you don't value something and it's not necessary for your survival, you don't need to engage in it. Anytime you recognize a should in your thought processes, you can probably let that go, unless it's really, really important to your own value system. Okay, next one is labels. Coincides with the DBT concept of judgment. Ugly, bad, stupid, loser, emotional wreck, failure, all those nasty things that our critical voice likes to tell us. One of the easiest examples to see that obviously if you're thinking these things about yourselves or others, you are firing negative emotions. And that's what we're trying to avoid when we look at and observe these cognitive distortions. So we would apply a non-judgmental stance, looking for ways to rewrite the distortion in a bland, observable, fact-based manner. Remember that when we have those whole body, whole soul evaluations like failure and loser, it's almost impossible to problem solve from that, right? Like that speaks to the core of who I am. And so when we take a judgment and we rewrite it as a behavioral descriptor, I didn't properly plan for the amount of traffic to get to the meeting today, and thus I was late, which allowed me to feel bad about myself. You can see how there's room for problem solving in that. It's not about who I am as a person. It's about actions I did or didn't take. And I can choose to go about that process differently the next time the situation arises. And we are at our final two, which are personalization and blame. Personalization is taking responsibility for things that absolutely are not factually your fault. You do not control the traffic in Houston, nor do I. You can leave my house at the same time every single day and have a completely different drive. There's no controlling that. So sometimes we just have to accept that like factors outside of our control were the prompting events that caused the situations we're currently experiencing. Blame is the opposite of personalization, and it's the outward projection of it's somebody else's fault. Placing blame on another typically increases negative emotion towards that person, while maybe giving yourself a sense of relief that you did not contribute to the situation. When we're looking at blame statements, if we can shift to neutral behavioral evaluations, just like personification, then it creates room for problem solving. So that wraps up the list we're going to cover. And for most people, they can recognize examples of most of these in their life. These are really, really prevalent. But again, they're things that we have the power to now begin to observe when they're present and change when they are negatively impacting the moment. So we want to start to practice noticing a distortion and rewriting a distortion. Because this information is not included in the DBT Spiral book, I'll shoot a link on the bottom of this page where you can get the best handout that covers the distortions, as well as some techniques specifically for rewriting each different type of distortion and a worksheet that you can print out to practice. See you soon.